Welcome to this week's meeting of the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. I am happy to welcome Siddhu Pachipala to our meeting today because he talks to us about a very important item, mental health, and specifically suicide prevention. He brings forward the idea that we can leverage technology to make things better, identify risk, and help each other. I love the idea of this. This was inspiring. I love that Siddhu is just in the beginning of his phase of making a difference and being a person of action. And I am thrilled to have him speak to our club this week. I hope you enjoy it too. I hope you have a great week. Thanks.
Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Every week, we bring you the stories of people who are making communities better all over the world. We see that as a local, global, digital enterprise. And our club, the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, is part of Rotary International, 1.4 million Rotarians and Rotaractors in 36,000 plus clubs all over the planet. All of these people are people who are intrigued by ways that we can make things better. And in the space of making things better, one of our distinguished members of the set participating today, our PIA master, Shag, sent me a note a while back saying, hey, you should read about this guy. And this guy turns out to be Siddhu Pachipala, who is a young man in Conroe, Texas, just finished off his high school studies. He's on his way to MIT. Siddhu, I got that right about your timing, right? Good. And he has come up with a very interesting way that we can look at figuring out who might be more or less at risk of suicide through using data in all the more effective ways. We're excited to share his story. If you want to read his full bio, then pause the video and on our YouTube channel, scroll down a bit, or on our SiliconValleyRotary.com page, scroll up a bit and take that in. But I will hand it over to you, Siddhu, now. Thank you very much for speaking with us and welcome to the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's not often that like someone straight out of high school gets the opportunity to talk to people as cool as Rotarians and Rotaractors, as you call them. So I'll make the most of the 12 minutes I have for y'all. So I'm going to share my screen. Hello, everyone. To start, I'd like you to just imagine a world without suicide, a world where people could discover their suicide risk early and get treatment before it's too late. That world seems like it's light years away, but the work I've done tugs us a little closer to it. How exactly? Well, there's this graph from a fellow suicide researcher at Yale, and I think it's pretty good at showing us what exactly the issue is in the United States. Now, sitting in the 21st century, we've gotten really good at stopping all kinds of deaths. You can look at our vehicle fatality or homicide rates over the past few decades, and there's clear drops across the board. But suicide tells a different story. Over the last few decades, suicide rates have plateaued and even gone up. But we stick to the same broken systems from the 1950s. And these are systems that our grandparents used. The problems with these systems start with figuring out exactly who is low risk and who is high risk for suicide. But that's contextually dependent, isn't it? Because one minute you could be experiencing the highest of highs and the next the lowest of lows. And modern risk assessments zoom out really far, having you sit down at monthly or yearly intervals to take a test. And tacked onto the fact is that these tests are highly subjective and one size fits all. So it makes sense why clinicians only are able to identify high-risk patients 5.5% of the time. And let's say you're one of the lucky ones who ends up finding out that you're high risk. You're still going to have to jump through institutional hoops to even get your foot in the door when it comes to treatment. 80% of suicides happen in developing countries. And even in developed countries, a lot of people are forced on to take debt to go to out-of-network care providers for mental health treatment. And that treatment most of the time doesn't even work because in psychiatry, unlike other medical fields, knowing your symptoms and a diagnostic label doesn't point to specifically what's wrong in your body. So a clinician has to guess and guess and guess until a single appointment becomes 20 and it's too late. And for every statistic I spit out, there's a story there too. A story about beautiful people with beautiful hopes and dreams, and a story that 1/3 of Americans can tell. 1/3 of Americans know someone claimed by suicide. And when we're seeing revolution and revolution after what feels like every single area of science, biotechnology, machine learning, clean energy, it feels like psychiatry is sitting in the dust. So in this study, I moved away from traditional pen and paper risk assessments and face-to-face interview appraisals and towards something new, specifically analyzing people's writing in two domains, syntax and semantics. Those are some pretty weird linguistics terms, but they're pretty intuitive concepts when you really look at them. Syntax is how you write. So how are you arranging your words and phrases to form larger sentences? And semantics is what you're writing. What is your word choice? What is the meaning and emotion and tone of that word choice? Now, this might be kind of surprising to y'all, but I'm not actually a licensed clinician. So I legally can't ask people about their suicidal behavior and assign them treatments. But I can build a database of adult diary entries and their results on the suicide status form, which is this assessment that classifies them into low, moderate, and high suicide risk scores and assigns them treatment until it's successful. So I end up using this powerful tool called computational linguistics to convert these diary entries, which are just collection of words, into hundreds of quantitative, syntactic, and semantic descriptors. And then I use machine learning, right, which is this big buzzword. But essentially what it does is it's able to automatically find correlations between these hundreds of linguistic features and then participants' suicide risk score, something that, no one human can do. So what exactly did I find? That's the exciting part, right? And I found that based only on a person's semantics, I can identify their suicide risk with about 98% accuracy and their optimal treatment with about 87% accuracy. Using syntax is less effective. It's about 69% and 46% accurate, but even that is still more accurate than our current system. So with that said, I've kind of incorporated this into a prototype of what this might look like in the future, something called SuiSensor. So you might imagine SuiSensor as constantly scanning writing that you have in the background. So whether that's text messages or social media or email correspondences to predict suicide risk levels. And it can recommend an affordable and local suicide risk evaluation when it reaches a concerning threshold. And clinicians too could use SuiSensor to monitor patient progress and get informed treatment recommendations instead of just having to make the guesses that they do. It's been more than a decade since the NIMH announced that our risk assessments and treatment appraisals have basically reached their limits. And there hasn't been a viable replacement until the study. So SuiSensor could bring psychiatry where it belongs in the 21st century. And I think there's a couple exciting lessons here just beyond how exciting SuiSensor is, which is one, a new philosophy of approaching psychiatry. SuiSensor bridges the gap between psychiatry, linguistics, and computer science, fields that normally wouldn't be sitting at the same table. And I think for far too long, psychiatry researchers have stuck to what's tried and true. N equals 300, 2x2 experimental design, factorial ANOVAs, they're afraid to dip into uncharted territories for now, like big data or machine learning. And I think that's that fear that's kept the field behind the rest of medicine, which I think sees a new wearable sensor or drug what seems like every other day. And I think we need more of these interdisciplinary approaches to push the needle. And then a second thing is a new framework. We can use what's called real-world data. So information individuals routinely generate over the course of their day. So in this study, it was writing, but you can imagine speaking or heart activity to then predict any number of psychiatric conditions. One day your Apple Watch could say that your walking patterns are characteristic of schizophrenia, or your phone could tell you that your vocal patterns point to a substance abuse disorder. Or even, the Zoom platform that we're on could say your facial movements are characteristic of major depressive disorder. And that all starts with SuiSensor. So I'd like you to imagine that world again that we dreamt up at the start. The one where people could discover their suicide risk early and get treatment before it's too late. We're still not there, and there's a lot more steps to go beyond SuiSensor. But SuiSensor is just that, a step in the right direction, and I hope there's many more to come.
Fantastic, Siddhu. I am so impressed. What we'd like to do, go ahead and have you stop sharing, and I'll introduce the group that we've got on the recording. We have a number of members of our club from several different parts of the planet, and excited to introduce them. Okay,
Are you still seeing the
I'm going
screen?
to edit this part out as well. There we go. Let me get this in.
Yeah, I don't want the world to see how bad I am.
All right, let me make this all galleried up. Right. And before I kind of take us back into it, Susan, you're here in the Bay Area, right? Okay, good. All right.
Marin County, Russ.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So, fantastic job, Siddhu. I'm excited for us to talk about this. Let me introduce some folks we have got on the recording. These are all members of our club. We have in Houston, Texas, Rory. We have in the Bay Area, we have Sandy. In Italy, we have Cecilia. In the Bay Area, we have Shags. We have in British Columbia, we have our president, Nick. And also here in the Bay Area, Susan, and yours truly. All right. So we will jump into the Q&A. I'll start with this. Siddhu, when I first read about your work, I actually assumed that the writing that was being analyzed was writing from prompts. So asking people to respond to certain kinds of questions in order to compare that against a data set that can be used to does it work that way as well? I was really intrigued by the idea that this would be incorporated into systems that people are already using.
Yeah. So in order to collect diary entries that you can actually use in a study, it has to be through that experimental apparatus. So this was in response to a prompt. So it was this value-free prompt that was basically trying to recreate what a diary entry would look like. So, please walk through your day, try to include as many details as you can, and try to reflect. So those are the kinds of writings that the model is trained on. This was a pilot study, so we're not sure how well it performs on other types of writing, be it social media, be it messages. So that's going to be more experimentation in the future.
Definitely. And how large was the sample size of the group whose writing you used to come up with the efficacy kind of rates that you quoted in the presentation?
So these were about 400 participants, but they had multiple diary entries over the span of 8 to 12 weeks. So it ended up being around 5,000 diary entries that I could train my model on.
Fantastic. All right. Cecilia, our treasurer in Italy, has a question about how this project got started. Did it start as a school project?
Yeah. So if you're familiar with the science fair, it's something that my school is really big on. I've been doing it since 7th grade, and I've always really been interested in psychology type research. So in 7th and 8th grade, I did some political psychology projects. So analyzing how people's opinions form and change on different, hot button political issues. And then in high school, I've been more focused on sort of clinical psychology and approaching it from that computational lens I talked about. So whether it be chronic stress or generalized anxiety disorder, or in this case, analyzing suicide risk, I've been trying to develop these tools that make use of this really exciting technology we have on the horizon. So I've mainly been using AI these past 4 years, and this is the example of, I think, really great things that can come of that.
I'll hand it over to Nick for the next question.
Probably have more than one, but I'll start with just listening to your response just there. Is there something that motivated you specifically? I mean, this is obviously something, like you said, 1/3 of people in the United States are impacted by suicide. Something that motivated you?
Yeah, I think it's sad, but I think a lot of people have a personal connection now when it comes to suicide. I've heard that every single time I've talked about my research. And I too, I think really recently, suicide has been something that's affected my community locally, especially the Indian community where I am. So that was definitely a part of it. And just seeing the kind of lack of through line between, we know that this is a big issue. I think anyone could tell you that we have a mental health crisis in America, that it's not just, the older people that we're concerned about anymore, as it used to be. That was really the main group that psychiatrists were worried about, which is the older Americans and the older people. But now we're seeing younger people suffer from things like stress and anxiety and depression, and seeing that yet we're still using the same assessments from the 1950s. We're still using essentially these approaches from the 20th century. And I think we need to be able to confront the status quo, and then try to disrupt it.
So, you bring up the expanded set of concerns across communities, right? And as I think about the use of data sets, I think about how they are so focused on, an English speaking developed world kind of environment, right? Is there a set of assumptions, cultural assumptions about what people will talk about that work themselves into the algorithms you use to help assess risk?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think, even in this, what seems like a straightforward study, we're already kind of limiting what we think about, right? So this, by virtue of including diary entries, this is only including people who can write, who are willing to write about their lives, people who are able to write in English in a study. So you kind of already narrowed who you're thinking about. And even when it comes to those diary entries, there's a variety of what people are willing to express, what people think of as retelling their day. I think, a Western audience might be more receptive to, expressing very small, very inner thoughts or very inner emotions that they wouldn't be comfortable sharing with the world. Whereas someone, from personal experience, as, children of immigrants, that's not something that's talked about, I think, as much. So that kind of disconnect is something that we need to address and create tools that are catered specifically for, for communities that have been neglected when it comes to these tools, and making sure that we're including in our data sets people of all ethnicities and races and genders. Because, even the data set I was using was, it didn't have a single Native American or Pacific Islander. It didn't have a single example of some of these groups that, are some of the statistically most likely to end up needing intervention. So I think there's concern on all fronts when it comes to that.
It makes me wonder what's next, because, especially knowing that you started this as a school project, although you're talking to us, obviously it's expounded beyond that. How do you want to keep it going? How do you, and obviously you have your life in front of you too. Is this a major part of this? Is this a side project, parallel project? Where is it for you?
Yeah, so I'm definitely interested in taking it with me wherever I go. So I'll definitely be in contact with researchers at MIT who are working at the intersection of psychology and technology, and seeing if they're really interested in taking up a project like this, trying to look at different ways to assess and intervene when it comes to mental health conditions driven by tech. And if so, I'd love to work on something like that with them, because I think it is a really research-driven institution and there's people working on everything. So I hope that I can, kind of contribute that. And if not, that's definitely something that I'll be thinking of when it comes to the future. I want to still be part of the group that decides to do it. That I don't want to completely, stop working on that. But I definitely want to expand the team that's working on it, because I think that definitely helps, with people who can contribute to the process.
I ask if there's an intersection with what you're doing now and neuroscience.
Yeah, I think that kind of points to why we need a system like this. So when you're walking into the clinic to get assessed, what psychiatrists are kind of forced to look at right now using that DSM system, which is the system we've used since the 1950s, they're looking at these external symptoms, right? They're looking at what they can see on the surface. They're looking at what you can report on the surface and assess when it comes to how have I been feeling over the past, year or 6 months or past few weeks. So it's really what we can report and what can be understood from patient to practitioner. But there is a lot more, as you mentioned, with neuroscience when it comes to conditions. These conditions are fundamentally not just, these conditions are biopsychosocial, as we say it in psychiatry. So there's biological elements to that when it comes to neuroscience, right? So even in depression, there's, neurotransmitters that are involved that are affected. There's things that happen with receptors with those neurotransmitters. There's things that happen to cortical regions in your brain when it comes to something like depression. There's psychological elements. Those are the things we're most familiar with. right? So how are we thinking? What are our patterns in cognition and memory that are affected? And then there's social patterns, which you might not be thinking about, right? So how are you interacting with other people? How do you think of yourselves in a social setting? All of those different arenas are affected. And I think that's what gets lost when we think of mental health really unidimensionally in the doctor's office. And I think that's something that can be, understood the full gamut of mental health by using something like machine learning. So, in your writing, you could be expressing 1,000 different things that really couldn't be understood by just, asking you, tell me about yourself, when you're in that doctor's office. So I hope that we can kind of move away from this model of mental health as something that you can, just rattle off. And it's this really complex, amorphous thing that it is, with far-reaching effects in every axis of your body.
Speaking of reach, is it also the case that you've done some work with National Geographic? You talk about it as civic tech. To what degree is there overlap? Well, actually, what is that? And to what degree is there overlap between that and the work you've done with SUI-Sensor?
Yeah, so civic tech is all about, innovating for, I guess, democracy in general. So you can take as example, change.org, which is this online platform you see which hosts petitions, and anyone can start a petition. Anyone can send it to anyone else, and you're able to see those petitions grow like crazy. And that's a great example of civic tech, because what it's using is it's using, emerging technology. So the internet, for example, in that case, and using it to put power in the hands of individuals. So, before you could almost think of petition writing and petition spreading as something that was done by, activists or like the select few of the politically engaged. But now I think every high schooler or middle schooler knows what change.org is and has used it for everything, trying to change the food in the cafeteria, or trying to, things as small as that, or things as big as, trying to stop a bill in their state legislature. So it's kind of democratizing power. And I think there's a parallel when it comes to this, which is, trying to help people understand their mental health, putting it right back in their palms with their devices, and trying to help them understand, okay, am I going through just a bout of sadness, or is this something of major concern that I should probably see a clinician about? So trying to help them understand that line. So it's, moving it away from just the doctor's office. I think the doctor's office is still a big component, and also back into your home to try to understand that. So I think there's a parallel there. So tech to help people regain power.
So do you see the use of SUI-Sensor as something that gets people to professionals more than it is for a tool of professionals, or is it pretty much in both camps?
I think it is in both camps. So helping people get to professionals, because, I don't think people trust an AI to be doing all the work for them. And I don't think we should have to do that. So I think that partnership is what we need instead of a replacement. But yes, getting the people to the doctor's office who need to be there, and then also helping that clinician make sure they're using the right course. Because right now in psychiatry, it is a lot of guesswork, whether someone gets administered cognitive behavioral therapy or antidepressants or electroconvulsive therapy. There's so many treatments, but not a lot of clues to figure out which treatment is most apt. So something like this could provide a really great blueprint for individualized treatment.
Final question before we wind things down. Your work with SUI-Sensor, was that the core of your application to MIT?
It was one of many parts. I think my application focused on the potential of science like this to address social issues. So I think it's generally part of that, my overarching idea for what I want to do. So definitely that intersection between, these really deeply seated issues we see. So mental health crisis, or the research I did in junior high, gun control or climate change, these, what we think of as issues that are reserved for politicians, can really be a great step for innovators and tech researchers and scientists to step in and see, can we maybe, we still need some policy to step in, but can we maybe try to innovate in that space to help lessen the burden on people in the meantime? So, when it comes to something like this, we still need action when it comes to replacing the DSM system, helping clinicians move away from this one size fits all care to really precision medicine. That's still going to be something that has to happen on the policy front, but it can be paired, I think, with really great scientists working on really great science. So I think that is what I focused on in my application at my team. This is definitely a part of it.
Well, fantastic. Well, we'll hand it back to you in just a minute for the final word, but I'm nothing but confident that you are going to find lots of good opportunities in the coming 4 years to pursue this in all sorts of ways. And we look forward to having you back at some point and tell us about what you're learning and what you're making happen. So all of you who have been watching this recording, thank you for joining us. The Rotary Club of Silicon Valley works to share stories that can inspire people around the world to see possibilities for improving their own communities. That you'll see what happens when people get together and say, hey, what if? And so along those lines, we hope that you will also share your thoughts. A little farther down the page, you can, in our discuss prompt on the SiliconValleyRotary.com page, you can let us know what you thought of this program and then also the different elements of the meeting. And we hope that you will engage with us in that way as an online and asynchronous clubs. It's one of the ways that we are able to share thoughts with each other. As we always like to do, we hand it back to our speaker for the final word. So Siddhu, I hand it to you.
Thank you. I just want to finish off with what I think is probably the biggest lesson when it comes to this. Of course, the findings are really surprising and I think they could guide a lot of amazing research, but I think something in the process of creating SUA-Sensor was one of the biggest lessons. Everyone knows that when you start off a study, you're going to have to do a lot of research. You're going to have to probably read hundreds of studies, either on their own accord or by via of their high school teacher. So I had to also read hundreds of studies, and I think that's a big part of it. But I think something that we miss a lot in research is the human aspect of that part. Listening to the stakeholders in this, clinicians and patients, to make sure that the research doesn't live in a vacuum. And doing that helped me understand concerns that I probably wouldn't have gotten from just reading those studies. That the clinical psychiatry issue, that big mental health crisis we talked about, is also an issue of Medicaid or cultural stigma among communities of color, or of zoning laws, or of the very definitions of what is illness, what is health. And those are questions that, might seem more political or philosophical or social than scientific. But scientists, I think, also need to be aware and need to be thinking about those upstream contributors to what we think of as clinical outcomes, because it is those concerns that, when neglected, I think fester. So we need to be aware of them whenever we conduct our research. If we're not directly, engaging with those, then we should at least accommodate them. So making sure you have a diverse study size, making sure that you're having patients who are both insured and uninsured. I think there's a stigma around that in the science community, because I think scientists are supposed to be these really objective people. And I think there's room for objectivity when it comes to science. Whenever you're conducting your research, there is a degree of objectivity that needs to be had whenever you're analyzing your results and coming to conclusions. But I think when you're formulating your study, there's room for, going past what you might think of as science. And with SUA-Sensor, I think I did just that. There's room for talking to people who've been affected by crisis. There's room for talking to psychiatrists who are basically fed up with the system we have. And I think those conversations are just as important as the research we do in the beginning.
Excellent, Siddhu. Thank you again. And everyone, we will see you next week.